I have worked as a juvenile probation officer for almost 7 years now, and it has been my experience during that time to have observed the ways in which adolescent behavior can be criminalized and how that can contribute to negative outcomes for the youth that I work with. So that's what I've seen from a professional side. I also could probably be explained or described as probably somewhat of a juvenile delinquent myself when I was a teenager. I was pretty difficult at times. I would very much push the limits, and I can sympathize with many of these youth. I came from a very good family. I think my parents did a really good job at raising me, but I think that a lot of adolescent behavior is normal. It is about pushing boundaries and testing the limits. I think things were handled very differently when I was a child. I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, before the real tough on crime measures came about in the adult system and trickled into the juvenile system as well. So that's a little bit of my background and why I'm interested in the subject. So let's delve a little deeper into this topic. So the following are a couple examples of what I mean when I say criminalizing adolescent behavior. The first is an example. It was a 16-year-old boy who was charged with a felony for stealing a candy bar from a vending machine. And then the other example is where a 15-year-old girl was charged with domestic violence because of having a fight with her sister over items of clothing. I would argue that many behaviors like this are a part of being a normal adolescent. Learning along the way, learning lessons, being taught different lessons, pushing boundaries, and being corrected. I stole a candy bar. I was grocery shopping with my mother. I was probably 10 years old. I would say probably not older than 10 years old. And we made it all the way out to the car, and my mom noticed I had a candy bar. She asked me where I got it. I told her I had taken it from the store. You know, she kind of gave it to me because she knew that I knew better. And she marched me right back into that store and up to the clerk who had checked us out. And I handed it over to her. I apologized for doing it, and I was embarrassed. It obviously made a big impression on me. I never did that again. More importantly, the store didn't feel it was necessary to seek any charges for stealing the candy bar because my mother had managed it herself and did so in an appropriate manner. The other example, the domestic violence for fighting with a sister over clothing, oh my word, I lived in the same room, we shared a room, until we went to college. It was really horrible. We fought often and sometimes pretty viciously. Never over clothing though, because we had quite different tastes in clothing, but it was always able to be managed by my parents, and there was never a need for law enforcement to be called due to a dispute with my sibling. Study of arrests of youth ranging in age from 8 to 23 years old that was done by Brame, Turner, Paternoster, and Bushway in 2012 found that up to 26.8% of 18-year-olds reported having been arrested at some point during that age time frame. Additionally, the Bureau of Justice Statistics reports 1 in 3 youth being arrested by the time they reach the age of 23. As you can see, the number of juveniles affected by the implications of being arrested are around a quarter of the juvenile population. This really underscores the importance of addressing the issue of criminalizing adolescent behavior. So, looking at more involved information regarding what is typical adolescent behavior. Of course, this type of behavior should not be altogether excused, but research does show that it is very common for youth to exhibit delinquent behavior during their development. Research shows that youth prior to the age of 21 tend to be impulsive and lack the ability to consider the consequences of what they do. Furthermore, research suggests that most delinquent behaviors reach a threshold during adolescence and are almost non-existent by the age of 20. So should youth be criminalized during what is considered to be a typical behavior of an adolescent? The implications of criminalizing typical adolescent behavior leads to poor outcomes for youth's futures, and I'll be reviewing that more in the slides that follow. I would just say impulsivity, failure to consider consequences, and the ability to regulate emotions. Another personal example, I hope I'm not boring you to death with these, but I was younger than 12 probably, a neighbor kid and I was quite the tomboy. We had our slingshots and we went in, I was in a small rural community, and we went into the neighbor's turkey farm and into the turkey coops, the big large buildings where the turkeys were housed, and we went through 3 of those buildings and shot out every light bulb in the building with our slingshots. Talk about an impulsive thing to do and a complete lack of considering any type of consequences. Fortunately, the neighbor, the owner of the farm, did not call law enforcement. Somehow he knew it was us. I don't know if our reputations preceded us or he saw us, but he ended up showing up at our parents' houses, explaining what had happened. Of course, we were extremely embarrassed, admitted to it, and both of us worked on the farm to work off the debt of replacing all those light bulbs. So I'm just saying that, giving an idea here that there can be other ways to manage some of these behaviors that are fairly typical. So now we're going to get into some of the negative outcomes of criminalizing adolescent behavior. Some of the short-term consequences include a skewed concept of self, where the deviant label is internalized because of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it further perpetuates deviant behavior. So it becomes a cycle that they can't get out of. Youth who experience arrest while in high school are almost twice as likely to drop out as their peers who do not experience an arrest. Youth who experience an arrest in high school were not only more likely to drop out of high school, but were more likely to never attend college as well. In fact, arrested youth are half as likely to go to college as their peers who never experienced an arrest while in high school. Juveniles who have been arrested were also found to have a decrease in employment opportunities for young adults, and job offers to applicants with an arrest record happen half as often than to those without an arrest record. Reduced employment opportunities and loss of income have implications beyond the individual. This could be looked at as a collective harm that extends to the whole community, and maybe stretching even further, it strains the basic fabric of society. The research of Kirk and Sampson revealed data from a Chicago area school where students who managed to avoid the juvenile justice system had a 64% graduation rate. Their counterparts who had been arrested only managed a 25% graduation rate. So that's pretty huge right there. That shows that lack of involvement in the juvenile system can really be beneficial to a youth's future. Another consequence of criminalizing adolescent behavior is the way in which trauma plays into the situation. So in addition to the previously mentioned negative outcomes of a juvenile experiencing arrest, being arrested and involved with the traditional court methods can be traumatic for a child. A youth who has been arrested was quoted as saying, "I just remember thinking, oh God, I can't get arrested. I was small when I was a kid and the police were really big. And I remember thinking, I'm not big enough to go where they are trying to take me." That just shows that youth who may have already experienced trauma earlier in their lives, possibly as victims of abuse or neglect, they can be re-traumatized by an arrest and the traditional methods of court intervention in their lives. And this can just exacerbate trauma in their lives and carry well into behavioral problems in their future. So what are some of the interventions that are used for youth who are exhibiting delinquent behavior? First is your traditional methods. And as you can see here from the pictures, traditionally, kids are put in residential treatment programs or housed in juvenile detention facilities. And it doesn't look like a very therapeutic environment, as you can see from viewing these pictures. According to Wilson and Hogue, traditional court intervention methods are not the most successful approach toward reducing recidivism of juvenile delinquents. Recidivism is their likelihood to reoffend. In fact, Lieberman, Kirk, and Kim argue that juvenile arrests perpetuate offending and increase the likelihood of future arrests. As I mentioned earlier, juvenile arrests have been linked to high rates of high school dropouts and problems finding employment. These are a couple of the most notable pitfalls of the traditional court intervention modes of arresting, charging, and adjudicating juveniles. Another type of intervention that can be used is called the school youth court. The school-based youth courts are relatively newer methods that are beginning to be used more frequently as an alternative to the more traditional and more punitive methods of managing delinquent behaviors in an effort to avoid the criminalization of adolescents. Although school-based youth courts are becoming quite popular, there is little research at this point showing exactly how effective they are. A county near me in the state of Michigan, Kent County, is currently implementing a pilot program that is being used in one of their local schools, utilizing a formulation of the school youth court, and they're going to be monitoring it very closely to see what types of impact it has on youth involvement with the formal court system. So I hope to hear more about that as that proceeds, and if it's successful, I would love to see something like this enacted in the county in which I work. Okay, so more examples of intervention include diversion programs. They've become more popular, but most of them still start with some type of traditional intervention. Usually an arrest followed by some type of agreement between the youth and the court to avoid any actual charges. However, research has shown that any involvement at all in the traditional methods can result in the risk of reoffending, so that higher likelihood of recidivism. Wilson and Hogue found that diversion programs do a better job of reducing recidivism than traditional methods. However, there was a high degree of variability of success between the types of diversion programs being measured. Diversion programs utilized prior to arrest were found to be the most effective means of preventing subsequent interactions with law enforcement and the court system. Specifically, programs that worked with youth identified as low risk saw a greater level of effectiveness when youth were pre-charge versus post-charge. An additional benefit of diversion programs versus traditional interventions and possibly out-of-home placement is that the cost savings are built into these programs due to them being less restrictive. Diversion costs less than traditional methods of punishment, and it eliminates the ongoing cost of repeated offending. The cost of diversion programs are 40% less than the cost of an out-of-home placement. So 40% less than if a youth were being housed in a juvenile detention facility or in some type of residential treatment program. Those can be extremely costly programs, and if they're found to not reduce the rate of recidivism, then you're looking at repeat offenders, and that's going to cost even more money. So the most effective diversion program will appropriately assess the risk level of youth so that therapy can be applied to the specific needs of each child to best address their specific circumstances. Diversion programs are typically utilized when juvenile offenders are low to moderate risk to reoffend and their original crimes were not violent in nature. One of the reasons that this topic is important to me, as I discussed at the beginning of this presentation, is that I work in the capacity of, in essence, a juvenile probation officer, and that's in the state that I live in, the state of Michigan. And I wanted to get an idea for what other people or other states were doing and how it might be useful to apply some of these other methods of intervention in my home state. So law enforcement can actually be an intervening force itself, prior to, they have a lot of discretion, but they can also be mandated to not maybe enforce certain laws to their fullest, especially when applied to a juvenile. An example of this, a mandate to police, is that Florida mandated law enforcement to use civil infractions for violent first-time offenders. The program was found to be highly successful in reducing the number of subsequent arrests for juveniles. I think that this would be a completely appropriate mandate for law enforcement officers to use in the state of Michigan, especially when I look at the fact that more than 90% of the juveniles being arrested on their first offense are for non-violent offenses. So I think a mandate to the police in the state of Michigan would make sense to stop that first involvement with the court, if at all possible. Especially, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, for some of the seemingly, kind of petty and silly things, like the kid stealing the candy bar out of the snack machine, or the girl getting in the fight with her sister, getting charged with domestic violence. Well, that might be looked at as a violent offense. I guess it depends on the degree to what occurred between the siblings, but especially the candy bar incidents, that would seem to be perfectly suited to a situation like this. So what now? Again, I want to look at what's being done and how I would like to maybe apply some of those things to my home state. Once youth have been arrested, they become labeled as deviant by society, like we talked about earlier, and also by law enforcement. There's an adage among law enforcement of the usual suspects. You know, these kids become labeled, and then it's almost like law enforcement might almost actively seek them out in future incidents. Pre-charge diversion programs were found to reduce the likelihood of reoffending by 1.69 times. For this reason, diversion programs that can interject prior to arrest are the best diversion model to enact. Juvenile justice policy changes need to occur at the state level so that we can include legislative implementation of mandatory pre-arrest diversion programs in all juvenile courts. Each county would be responsible for enacting the mandatory diversion program. Another policy that could be enacted by legislature is to mandate that law enforcement utilize civil infractions where appropriate. So essentially, the kid gets a ticket and has to pay a fine. Hopefully this is enough to, quote unquote, scare them straight. You know, I think it worked for me when I was younger, so I think it can work for other kids as well. It would also be necessary to find a way to redo current funding structures due to the Michigan juvenile justice system currently having no incentive to use any type of pre-arrest diversion programs. The current funding is hinged on the start of when a petition is filed. So that would have to be redone on that funding side. Finally, although most of Michigan's 83 counties do already have some form of diversion program, they're not centrally organized, so it doesn't allow for their programs. It does allow their programs to differ from one county to the next. And I guess in some circumstances that could be beneficial depending on county resources, but it would be good to have some type of central organization. The information that was provided during this presentation are shown in the next slides and this slide for the research that I did and where that information came from. I would just like to end this presentation by saying I think it's important to think about these matters, how they could have affected you when you were younger, how they could affect maybe your children. You know, ask yourself, was there a time when I was younger where an intervention like this could have been beneficial to me versus something more court involved? Do you have an example? Can you think of an example where you did do something that alternative methods were used? And can you think of any other type of interventions other than the traditional methods? And are any of the methods mentioned, do you think any of them would be useful in your own communities? I would just think about a lot of this material and how it may have applied to your past, could be applied to your children's futures, or applied in your own communities. Thank you.